Hello, welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Patreon-only video. Continuing my coverage of Star Trek The Animated Series. This video, I'll cover episodes 5 and 6 of Season 1 of the animated series. So, let me start with episode 5, which is More Tribbles, More Troubles. And this is an interesting episode because this is the sequel to the Trouble with Tribbles, which I'm not sure how well received it was in the 60s and early 70s when it first aired, but it came it eventually became like the most popular Star Trek episode, and most top 10s and other countdowns would have it as number 1, as the best episode of the original series, which honestly, I always disagreed with. I always thought this episode was just okay. As a comedy, I didn't think it was that funny. I did my top 10 funniest episodes of Star Trek, and I didn't include any original series episode, and a lot of people had an issue with that. But I just think the 60s humor is outdated, to be honest, and I didn't find it that funny. So you can imagine that I did how I felt about the sequel to it in the animated series. Now, apparently, the writers have been wanting to do a sequel to The Trouble with Tribbles ever since the first one aired, but the showrunner or the producer who took over in season 3 hated that episode and refused to let them do a sequel, which is pretty interesting to note that he actually hated that episode. I don't know why. So when they did the animated series, they actually took the idea that they had for a sequel of Trouble with Tribbles, and they were finally able to do it because that producer guy wasn't there for the animated series. And apparently, the original idea was to introduce triple predators that multiplied just as much as the Tribble did, and then some of the crew members would go missing, so it's implied that the predators ate the crew members. But then the animated series decided that that would be a bit too dark for a kid show that aired Saturday mornings, which I actually agree with. Now, one thing I will say off the bat that really irritates me about this episode, because they do introduce the triple predator, and it becomes the plot point that the reason why the Klingons are attacking the Enterprise is because they want the triple predator back, because they created it. It was genetically engineered by the Klingons to take care of the tribbles on the planets that were infected with tribbles through the last incident. Now, here's the huge issue I have with that. In the first episode of The Trouble with Tribbles, they talked about the tribbles and how they multiply like crazy, and Dr. McCoy explained clearly that the tribbles on their homeworld have many predators that keep them in check. And in fact, the fact that they reproduce so fast and quickly is actually their way of protecting themselves from the predators, or their way of keeping their populations somewhat going and not becoming extinct, is because they breed so fast, because they're such easy prey. They have no other defense. They can't run. They're just lightly balls. And from an ecological perspective, that actually makes a lot of sense. That different species evolve differently, and some might evolve their protection to being easy prey, not having any defenses, to be able to reproduce. And in the same fashion, in their natural environment, they're not an ecological nuisance, because they are there's lots of predators that keep them in check, that prevent them from overproducing, because they're easy prey. So that makes sense. And the Trouble with Tribbles, where they were removed from that environment, where there was that natural balance that kept that nature balance in check, and they became an ecological nuisance. Well, that was a great metaphor for a lot of other invasive species that even in modern times that are introduced to other environments where they're not kept in check. And it causes ecological damage. Now, this is something I learned a lot about when I lived in New Zealand, because it's an isolated island, and a lot of predators were introduced from Europe. In fact, in New Zealand, there are no mammals. It's just bird life. I think the only natural mammal is a bat that's now extinct, or not extinct. It's endangered, I should say. Very rare. And so there used to be these very large birds called moas that are like the size of ostrich or bigger. That used to, so they were like the replacement for what, instead of having mammals, this is what roamed New Zealand. But when the first indigenous people, the Maoris, populated New Zealand, eventually they hunted them to extinction. But there's many other birds, a lot of unique birds that became endangered or extinct when the Europeans settled, and they brought with them lots of predators, unnatural predators like rats, mice, ferrets, stoats, and then possums from Australia. And now they're huge. These are pests that are constantly, wildlife workers are constantly trying to lay traps for them and kill them because they're killing off the natural wildlife of New Zealand. But the most interesting aspect of this, and why I bring this up, is there's a offshore island off the southern coast of New Zealand. That I think only 300 people live there, but a lot of tourists go there. I've been there myself. But the island itself is like the township is only in the small corner of the island. The rest of the island is mostly uninhabited. And there were kiwi birds. And if you're not familiar with New Zealand, kiwi is the national bird of New Zealand. Like, there's pictures of kiwis everywhere, and they even call New Zealanders kiwis. But this bird is actually endangered, and it's not very commonly seen. Like, most people haven't even seen one, except like in a zoo or wildlife thing. I only saw one because I went to one of these offshore islands and went like looking for one at night, and most people didn't even see one. I was lucky enough to see one anyway. So they're a national bird. They're really treasured, but it's on the endangered species list. And since there are people who live on this offshore island, they brought cats with them, house cats. And the cats have been known to kill the kiwi birds. So a lot of people thought, okay, we should ban cats from this island because they're killing our natural birds. So they did that. And as soon as they did that, the rat population exploded. And the rats ended up being a lot more harmful for the kiwi birds. So then they had to reintroduce and bring the cats back to the island in order to keep the rat population in check, and they just had to find ways to try to protect the kiwis from the cats because they need the cats there to keep the rats in check. Which I think that this, of course, their natural environment with the kiwi birds is that they're not supposed to have any predators like that, any mammals, because there were no mammals in New Zealand. So they're just having to try to do the best they can to restore that balance, but they can't get rid of all the pests that are there. Like the cats they could get rid of, but as soon as they did, the ones they couldn't get rid of exploded. So that's a very interesting, and so that's, I know it seems like a total tangent, but I think that's why I like the way the Tribbles were described in the original episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, because it was that balance, that because they were this trader who just wanted, oh, look at how cute they are, and wanted to make money off of them, wasn't taking into account the ecological necessities or damage of removing these animals from their natural environment and introducing them to a new one, and how it's implied that these Tribbles had run amok on Klingon planets and other planets because they don't naturally have that checks and balance that the original environment did. And I think that's an interesting aspect to cover in space travel, because if you have space travel and you take alien animals from one planet to a different planet or into space, and how much damage that could cause. So and I think because most people just see it as the funny, cute little episodes about furry balls that go coo, coo, but there was actually an underlining, deeper exploration of what space travel would be like and just how fragile ecosystems are. Now, What does that have to do with this episode? Why am I irritated that the Klingons had genetically engineered this triple predator? Well, as I just said, there's billions of natural triple predators on their planet. So why do the Klingons need to genetically engineer? In fact, they attack the Enterprise and they threaten Kirk to destroy his ship because they want this single predator back so badly because they say it's a prototype and they needed to invent more. Hey, morons! Go to the triple homeworld. There's billions of natural triple predators you can choose from. You don't have to go after Kirk and attack him from this. You don't have to genetically engineer one. And this is what irritates me about the writing, because this episode is written by the same person who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles. So they should be aware of this. They should know that in that episode, they specifically said there are tons of natural triple predators. So why is everyone making a big deal out of this one, and why do they think it's a huge new thing? Oh, a triple predator? That's wacky. That's a wild new idea. No, it's not. The Tribbles, they explain, have tons, not just one. They even specify this. They have many natural predators that kept them in check. So, I don't know. But then again, this could have been an interesting exploration, that if they did take some of those natural triple predators and put them in the environment of the Enterprise or whatever, that maybe wouldn't have the same effect that it did from their home world, because it's a different environment. In fact, if they could say that this happened on the Klingon world or some other world, that they took some Klingon predators, triple predators, and brought them to this Klingon world, and so they wiped out all the Tribbles, but then they themselves became a nuisance in other ways, which would be a great analogy to what happened. In fact, going back to New Zealand example, I believe that stoats, which I never heard of until I went to New Zealand, but it's a kind of rodent, it's like a ferret. But anyway, stoats were purposely introduced to New Zealand to try to keep in check the rabbit population, because the rabbit population was out of control. So the stoats became a pest themselves. And so this is a funny thing that keeps happening, that they think, oh, this is a pest, so let's introduce this other pest to get rid of the pest, and then they become a pest as well, and they just exaggerate the problem and make them seem kind of like morons. So that would have been an interesting thing to do if they played off of that, and somehow the triple predators. And I think that original script idea was actually more along those lines, that they brought the triple predators on board to keep the Tribbles in check, but then the predators started actually killing off the crewmen. That would have actually been more along those lines, and that's probably what the writer was thinking of. But I think there was a way they could have done that without, because obviously they can do the killing off crewmen for a Saturday morning cartoon. I agree with that. But they probably could have done another way to have that same sort of message and not ditch it entirely like this episode did. So, sorry, that was a big aside. But the episode itself, I think it's cheesy that the idea that the triples get bigger instead of... That seemed like a gimmick, that the triples keep getting bigger instead of multiplying. And then you find out at the end that they actually did multiply. McCoy shoots them with the serum, and so the giant triples just explode and all these tiny little triples come out. And then you have the triple predator that can keep them in check then. But that's silly. And that's another thing I did kind of like the Klingon aspect. They had this huge, this new weapon that could put ships in stasis. It made them a bit too powerful, I dare say. I'm kind of glad this wasn't an actual canon, but then, as I'll get to later in this video, a lot of people do consider the original series actual canon. In fact, I do believe this is the first time that we ever seen or mentioned the Klingon ship can cloak. The Klingons have cloaking technology. And I remember I got into an argument with someone online, and I mentioned that the first time we see a Klingon ship cloak was in Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. And they're like, first time we saw a Klingon ship cloak is the animated series. And I'm like, Yeah, if you consider that canon. I don't. I know it's officially now, but again, as I said, I think that's just a way for CBS to want to try to make more money off it. They're trying to get more people to watch it. So they call it canon, but I don't really consider it canon. I still think that but yeah, I guess you could say the first idea of, Klingons cloaking was in the animated series, but yeah, whatever. But anyway, yeah, that stasis field weapon that the Klingons had was never mentioned again. So, I guess that's not considered canon. But anyway, I didn't like this episode that much. I thought it was okay. Like, I did think the plot with the Klingons, like, trying to chase after them and the cat and mouse game was done really well. I like how Koloth was portrayed as someone who was actually a really good tactician. And it was really actually interesting to see the tactical battle between Kirk and Koloth. It kind of reminded me of, God, what is that wrong? Balance of Terror. But, not as, of course, intense as that, obviously, because this is a fun Tribble episode. But I still had that sort of concept of like two great tacticians going after each other, and I actually thought this episode did that fairly well. But of course, Koloth in this episode was voiced by James Doohan because they couldn't get the original actor who played Koloth, so James Doohan actually did a lot of the other guest voices, because for the most part, I think there's a few exceptions where they got like the director of Film Nation, which is the company that produced this show. The founder director of that would often do voices on his cartoons because he was too damn cheap to hire people. But other than that, basically the cast members themselves voiced all the different characters. Like, so they rarely did they get. I think there were 3 exceptions. It was Mark Leonard, who did Sarek in Yesteryear. And I think there are 2 other examples. Oh, yeah, it's Cyrano Jones. This episode itself, the dude who does Cyrano Jones was actually the original actor who played Cyrano Jones in Trouble with Tribbles. And then there's one other example where they had I think it was Harry Mudd. The dude who does Harry Mudd, which we'll get to that later. But other than that, I think this is the only time they had guest actors. Other than that, the original cast did all the guest star voices except for that one dude from Film Nation who did a couple as well. But anyway, and sometimes I don't think they're really that good at it. And speaking of that, I should mention that this is the first episode that we see Lieutenant Imress, who is in this episode and the next episode. You can see her in the picture there. She's the cat lady. The cat woman, for lack of better terms. And they actually had her species featured in the background in Star Trek 4, I believe. In Star Trek 5, they actually attacked one of them, attacked Kirk. It was like a cat woman. Looked a bit different in person. So, and it's an interesting, like, her and Rex are interesting that they have these weird aliens, and that's something they couldn't do in the original series because they're limited by budget, which they could do in the animated series, so that was cool. I actually wish they would explore, but they're not interesting characters in themselves. They're just two-dimensional, Captain, yes, Captain, and don't really have much personality, shall we say. And Imress is voiced by Nigel Barrett. It's quite obvious. She just tries to drawl out her make it sound like cat-like or whatever. It's a bit silly. And I think later episodes, not these 2 episodes, but I think later episodes she actually added in a purr. Meow, purr. But anyway, or meow or something. But that's the other thing. I mean, the original cast are good actors, but they're not professional voice actors for cartoons. They're not very good at doing different voices, which I'll definitely get into that in the next episode. But as for this episode itself, it's mostly a comedy episode, and I hated the humor. I think that I talked about how I don't like the original series humor. This is way worse. If this was a live action episode, I would say that the humor in this episode was very cartoonish. But then again, this is a cartoon, so I do have to allow it some leeway for that. But if I think about I've seen a few cartoons from the 70s. I remember watching some when I was a kid, and I don't remember them being this cheesy. I think this goes beyond, it definitely goes beyond modern cartoon cheesiness. Modern cartoons are not nowhere near as, outwardly cheesy as this is. And so all the jokes were horrible. They were cringe-worthy. I was just oh, God. For example, the end of the episode when McCoy shoots the giant Tribble with the serum and it just explodes into all the tiny Tribbles and they all fall on top of Kirk. It was an obvious callback to the Trouble with Tribbles when all the Tribbles fell on Kirk. And Kirk's just uh-oh, did it again. And I'm just and he even winked at the camera or some bullshit at the end of the episode. I was just oh my God, that's so bad. And one of the best things about the Trouble with Tribbles is not just the storyline with the Tribbles or whatever, but the camaraderie between the crew and their comedic timing and their interactions are very lighthearted, more so than most episodes. And actually, the actors did a great job with that. That really comes off on screen. But this episode, they tried to recreate that, but it just does not work in this animated format because of the animation is so stilted, and I guess they didn't integrate the voice acting with the animating. You feel like they're trying to have that same camaraderie, that same sort of comedic timing, but it just does not work. The animation is just so bad, and it's just it's stilted. I think is the best word to describe it. It just feels very not animated. Ironically, it's just they're just sitting there talking, going, "Oh, Mr. Spock, ha 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 ha," and then you cut to. It's just not good. It just doesn't work. There was one joke that kind of made me crack a smile. That I actually liked, and that's when they're talking to Cyrano Jones, and Spock had a very long-winded Spock-like way. He was oh, the Tribbles mass produce on a massive scale and they constantly produce a lot, blah, blah, blah. And he had a Spock way of saying that. And then Cyrano Jones was yeah, and they breed a lot, too. And I was all right, that's funny. I did think that was funny. But other than that, I thought the humor not only was not funny, it was cringe-worthy. So anyway, my rating for More Tribbles out of 10 is a 6 good. I'm not going to give it a negative rating because, as I said, there's some positive aspects. Particularly, as I said, the tactical battle between Koloth and Kirk I actually really liked. I think that worked well, more so than most animated series. And the main, through story with having to deal with the Tribbles again, it was fun. But whenever they tried to inject humor into it, it was just oh, stop! Stop! It was just so bad. And then the whole Predator thing pissed me off because they're just ignoring the fact that they mentioned there are tons of natural predators for the Tribbles. They don't even bring that up. That really annoys me. So I can't give it more than a 6, but I think this episode's interesting enough to earn a positive rating. Anyway, let me get to the next episode, which is The Survivor. Now, on the surface, I thought this episode was kind of just a rip-off of Man-Trap, or just another version of Man-Trap, because you have this alien shapeshifter who's taking the form of a loved one of a crew member. In this case, the crew member just happens to be some red shirt snowblow security officer who, of course, is just introduced for this one episode, voiced by Michelle Nichols. But anyway, when I was talking about the voice actors and how some of them do a terrible job, so the episode begins with them getting this famous humanitarian named Carter Winston, who's missing for 5 years, and they find him, and then he comes on board. And it's so obvious he's voiced by William Shatner. It sounds so cheesy, too. William Shatner does not do a good job of doing a different voice. It just sounds like William Shatner doing a silly William Shatner voice. It's like, yes, and I'm just like, oh my god, come on now. This is pretty bad. But anyway, the Carter Winston turns out to be a shapeshifter. And, of course, his fiance, who they never got married, just so happens to be a security officer on the Enterprise. Although I did like that we got a female security officer and how she played an important part of this role in the show, even though her main role was just to pine over her fiance and be like, oh, why don't you love me anymore? But they actually, I was surprised on how good they actually made the love story. I could see the good writing of the script coming through, even through the bad execution of the animation, because it was about like this alien shapeshifter who cared for Carter Winston until he died, but he started taking on this form, and it kind of explained through the clunky exposition, which is commonplace in the animated series, that when a member of his species takes on the form for so long, he starts to feel the same way that this person feels. And I think that makes sense, knowing that he knew him from over a year. So it's interesting that he starts to take on his characteristics and his feelings, and that includes the love that he feels for Anne, the security officer. And so Anne starts to, even though she acknowledges and she knows that this is not her fiance, her lover, that he's dead, but it's still a remnant of him, because this alien who took his form identifies as him and shares some of the same feelings and characteristics. So she still cares for this alien being and doesn't mind. Like, it's another great message about not caring about beauty, because it doesn't mind it as a weird, ugly looking alien flitting thingy with all these tentacles, because she can see past that and see that he's become a good person through Carter Winston's influence. But she knows enough to not be like, oh, let's get married and let me just pretend that you're Carter Winston. She has that. She is that strong of mind to know that there is a difference, that this is a different alien who isn't her fiance, but so she doesn't want to be in love with him, but she still sees enough of Carter in him to sort of care for him and want the best for him. And I really like that. Although I think it's kind of dumb that because at the end of the episode, because the alien tried to originally, trick them into going into Romulan neutral zone and be killed by the Romulans, but then at the last second he changed his mind and he became a force field, or the shields around the Enterprise, which I think that's a bit far-fetched, I gotta say. But anyway, yeah, that's ridiculous. But he saved the Enterprise. And so Kirk was grateful. It was like, look, you'll still have to stay in trial, but I'll vouch for you on the trial, so you'll probably get a light sentence, so you get off fine, but you still need to stay in trial, and we're going to put you under guard. And then Anne, a security officer, is like, oh, can I be assigned to guard him? And Kirk's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. No, isn't there like the definition of conflict of interest that to have someone who has such personal attachment, you can't assign them as their security guard. I mean, that's just bad captaining there. I'm sorry there, Kirk. That's just a bit ridiculous. Now, before I get into the rest of the episode, there's one little nugget that was kind of casually thrown in at the start of this episode that I was like, what? And I had to stop, rewind it, watch it again, and still stop, rewind it, watch it again. It's at the start of the episode when Carter Winston comes on board and McCoy is like, oh, I've heard of you. You did great things. You helped, this plague or whatever help causes hunger or whatever on this planet that my daughter was living on. And I was like, yeah, okay. What? Daughter? What? What are you talking about? So I watched it again. And so I looked it up on Memory Alpha, and there's a whole page for Joanna McCoy, which is Leonard McCoy's daughter from a previous marriage. I think it might have been mentioned in other episodes, or maybe even the movies. McCoy mentioned having multiple ex-wives. According to the Memory Alpha, I think it was 2 ex-wives. And so he had a daughter in one of those marriages. But this is the only mention of her in canon, which is very loose, as I say, if you consider this canon, which I kind of don't. But apparently it was DeForest Kelley and DC Fonda's idea that McCoy have a daughter from a previous marriage, and they tried to incorporate this into the show itself, but at the last second it kept getting rewritten. The original idea was to have her come on board the Enterprise and then Kirk form a romance with her and this create a strain between Kirk and McCoy, which I'm glad they never did, because that's a bit creepy. I mean, I suppose they said that she was training to be a nurse, but I suppose she'd be around like 18, 19, 20 years old. And for Kirk to have a romance with a 20-year-old who happens to be McCoy's daughter, I'm sorry, this is a bit too creepy. I'm glad they didn't do that. In fact, the episode The Way to Eden, one of the space hippies was supposed to be Joanna McCoy. In fact, they said the episode was originally titled Joanna. And then she was going to have a romance with Kirk, but then they decided to get rid of that and focus on the space hippies, which probably did make that episode a lot worse, if I'm going to be honest. But, so they planned on doing it in the 4th season, but then again, obviously there never was a 4th season. But they didn't even show her in the animated series. Well, I'm glad they couldn't really have her and Kirk hook up on, no. But at least they just mentioned her. But they didn't say her name. That was something that they came up with, and off screen, DeForest Kelley and DC Fonda, but they never actually incorporated it into any of the episodes, and it's never mentioned again. So that's a very interesting. I did not know that. I'm learning something myself. I did not know that McCoy had a daughter named Joanna, but here you go. But anyway, getting back to the rest of the episode, again, I was surprised of how interesting, because at first I thought this would just be a boring rip-off of the Man Trap, and at first it was very clunky, like, oh, this is a security officer who just so happens to be the guy's former fiance, and then the alien takes the form of different people, and of course we've seen that before, and he takes the form of McCoy, as McCoy tries to convince her to just forget about him, and then you find out later that the alien's trying to convince Anne to forget about Carter, because he knows that he's dead and he knows that he isn't Carter, and it's best for her, but she is actually strong of mind in order to accept this new being for who he is, and see good in him and acknowledge that it isn't Carter. So I actually really like that. I think the plot with the Romulans and how they tried to get in a neutral zone and it turned out to be a Romulan ploy, that was pretty interesting too. So all in all, I thought it was a surprisingly good episode. So my rating for The Survivor out of 10 is a 7. Very good. Cool. So that is it for my review of animated series, Season 1, Episode 5 and 6. I'll be back next month to cover the next 2 episodes of the animated series. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for all the support you provide. My channel is very much appreciated, and I'll see you guys next time.